Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on the future of NatRep. I am Deborah Harding. I'm the Managing Director of the Market Research Society, and I'm your host today for this webinar, but I'm taking a bit of a back seat. It will be largely being led by Rebecca Cole, the Managing Director of Cobalt Sky, and also the Chair of the Representation in Research Working Group. Before I move over to Rebecca to take the lead, this session will be recorded and will be available on the MRS website so that you can listen to it afterwards, but also share it with colleagues, which we encourage you to do so. And we'd also welcome questions from you. So if we've got, it's kind of a game of two halves today's session. So the second half will be for more of a panel discussion. So if you do have questions, if you could submit those in the Q&A function on Zoom, we will deal with those in the second half. And now I'm going to take a bit of a back seat until the discussion later on, and I'm going to pass you over to Rebecca.
Thank you, Deborah. Yeah, and thanks everyone for attending. So as Deborah said, we're going to do two things today. The first part will be where I'm going to take everyone through a report. So I'll share my screen and the report that the Representation and Research Group ran earlier in the year around NatRep and the future of it. And then we'll move to a Q&A session. As Deborah said, yeah, put questions in the questions chat, but also, you know, feel free to just put any comments or thoughts or your own experiences of what we're discussing in the chat as well, so you can kind of share with each other any thoughts that you have on it. Whilst I'm sharing the screen, I'm not going to be able to see the chat or the FAQs, but we'll come back to them at the end. And when we do, just so it's not all just me, I've got some other people on the panel who can help answer some questions today. So we've got Sanya Hack, who is Head of Research at AudienceNet, and she's a DI&E and intercultural specialist. She's also recently designed and she delivers the new MRS training on goodbye stereotypes. So she's a great person to have on the panel for any questions. And we've got Graham Idahan, who's Senior Director of Customer Success at Cint, and he's also a co-founder of Core. And of course, we have Deborah for any kind of specific questions you've got around code of conduct or GDPR, ONS, anything like that. She's our resident expert on that. So I'm going to share my screen. As I said, we won't be able to see anything, so if this doesn't work, then maybe one of the other panelists can let me know. But is that working, and can everyone see that? Yeah, I can see that. Okay, thank you. Okay, so just a bit of background on the research that we did. So it was designed to understand the extent to which some specific characteristics, those being non-binary gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and physical and or mental health conditions, factor into the current understanding of what we call NatRep research in the UK. The survey went out to all MRS company partner companies. We did it so that each company would only complete the survey once. And as I said, it was made clear that we are at the moment in this piece of research only looking at NatRep research conducted in the UK. So we had responses submitted by 49 companies. So that's 49 individual companies submitted. So if you're on the call and you completed that survey, thank you very much. We appreciate it. If you didn't, then this is going to run annually. So please do keep an eye out for it next year. We would have liked more responses. We had an additional 19 companies who completed the screener, but weren't able to take part in the full piece because NatRep research wasn't something that they worked on. However, you know, inclusion is a bigger topic than just NatRep, and those 19 people were given the opportunity to give any thoughts or feedback they had on that area in general, and we've included those where it's relevant. We split the research into 3 separate parts. So we wanted to ask specific questions to research buyers, so kind of end clients. We then had a section where we were talking specifically to research agencies, people working directly with end clients, and then a separate section for providers of research participants, so panels. Those of you doing quick maths in the table on the right, you'll see that some companies, of course, can do more than one of those things. So if that was the case, and they were also, for example, an agency, but also a panel provider, they were eligible to take both parts. So that's why we actually have 5 research buyers, 35 agency responses, and 16 panel provider responses. So I just want to say before we start, sorry, a big thank you to Kantar and Deborah Fox specifically, who really helped us with the design and the report on this. We really appreciate that. So just some caveats, as I said, due to the small sample size, we have assumed that the data is directional rather than definitive. So in a lot of places, we're not showing exact percentages because you obviously a base of 49. It's worth saying that, you know, in all the work that we've done in this space, there was nothing in the results that led us to think that, you know, it wasn't indicative of what we would have been seeing. I don't think the results would have been particularly different if we'd had a higher base size. But transparency, it's 49 responses. So the first question that we asked people, and this was an open, spontaneous question, was when UK research is described as nationally representative, which characteristics do you think are included in that definition? So this was an open question. There were 10 boxes, so they could write up to 10 characteristics of what they think are included. And if you look at the table on the right, you know, I think we would all expect this, but, you know, it's good to kind of just get it proven that overwhelmingly the ones that are considered to be included by definition are age, gender, and region. That was followed closely by social grade. Ethnicity was actually nearly 50%. Which we were pleased with. So 50% of people spontaneously said that they think ethnicity is included in a definition of nationally representative, higher than I expected. And income was also mentioned by a significant number of people. Sexual orientation and health and disability were only mentioned by 2 out of 49 of those respondents. So you'll see that obviously that is very low. And only 3 participants specifically said extended gender, so mentioned extended gender categories other than male and female. So that's why we've kind of split those out on that gender bar. That isn't to say that we can't assume that people saying gender didn't also mean extended gender, but only 3 kind of explicitly mentioned it. So we asked people just generally what they thought of the current status of this, you know, in terms of how representative do we think NatRep samples are, what kind of work needs to be done in this area. And there was an overwhelming engagement with this topic. Most people were kind of very open about the fact that this is an issue, that there are problems with our kind of claim that our NatRep work is truly representative. There was a lot of a sense that if we're going to try and improve this, we have to do it fully and properly, and not just pay lip service to it. So there was lots of concerns around the fact that sometimes maybe research is claiming to be representative of maybe minority groups, but actually they're only being captured in small numbers and then weighted. You know, that the industry itself, it needs to be turned on its head, and that it needs to be thought about from the start rather than just capturing a small number and then, you know, using weighting as well. And there was, you know, some good shout outs from people going, you know, that the work that MRS has already been doing in this ED&I space needs to be built on. But as I said, everybody was very much aware that this is an issue. It's something that we do need to look at, but that it's not a short conversation and it's not a short journey, you know, and it's not something that we're going to solve overnight, and that the appetite is there to solve it deeply and rootedly rather than just trying to paper over it. So we then asked people, this was a question where we gave them responses, which was, you know, okay, so out of this list of demographics, which of these are you using when setting your quotas on NatRep projects? So again, as you can see, you know, and again, just looking here at the 4 characteristics that we're focusing on, ethnicity was by far being asked the most as a quota and being used as a quota, followed by extended gender. Sexual orientation is very rarely being used as a quota variable, and physical and mental health conditions is only slightly more common than sexual orientation. You'll see this as we go through, and it's part of the reason why we kind of split the questions out and we asked individually about these 4 characteristics, because you'll see as we go through, there is a different opinion and there's a different appetite for ethnicity to be included, for example, than there is for sexual orientation, than there is for health. So that's why it's important that we split them out. We're aware that, you know, there's different methodologies and they are not all the same. So we did, in fact, ask these questions not only split out by characteristics, but also split out by face-to-face Nat Rep, CATI Nat Rep, online quant Nat Rep. But unfortunately, again, going back to our base size of 49, it wasn't high enough to actually split those out. But it did show us some things. So, for example, extended gender was more likely to be asked in online studies as a quota than it was to face-to-face and CATI. So there are definitely some distinctions between the mode of research, but unfortunately our numbers weren't high enough to really split those numbers out. One of the things that we found when we're talking to all sorts of stakeholders about this is one of the issues that gets raised a lot, and it's really a kind of a cost driver that panel providers find, which is their ability to pre-target people. So this is true with kind of anything, you know, if they hold information about their respondents, whether it's do you own a dog, do you own a cat, etc., that enables them to pre-target those respondents rather than just going out to general pop, which means that the IR is higher, and it means that they can get the sample more efficiently and therefore cheaper. So, you know, ideally in a perfect world, you'd be in a situation where, let's say you were asking a quota on ethnicity, that the panel providers would already hold that information so they could specifically target the people they need. So we asked the panel providers, which of these characteristics do you hold? Oops, sorry, I've gone too far. There we go. Yes, do you hold this information about your panels already? You know, because of course panel providers ask respondents to fill out all sorts of things when they first sign up. As you can see, you know, no one is saying that they can access, very few people are saying that they can access all of these for all respondents. We should point out that obviously under GDPR, you know, even if panels are asking respondents to tell them this when they sign up, they will have to have offered the opportunity to say prefer not to say. So I would be extremely surprised if, you know, any panel held this on 100% of their sample, because they would have had to have allowed some people to say that they didn't want to tell them that information. But again, looking through, as you can see, you know, panels do have more information about ethnicity of their panelists than anything else. And I think this is something that panels are looking at in terms of trying to improve the information they have. And again, that's to try and help with the targeting and the efficiency of sampling. So we also asked panel providers, and this is something, you know, that we were really interested in, was do they have any specific recruitment practices that they use when trying to kind of reach groups that maybe had previously been underrepresented? Because we know through conversations with people that, you know, if panels want to improve the representation they have, they may need to think about alternative ways of recruiting and engaging with those people, you know, away from their kind of more historical practices. They may need to go out to different places. They may need to think about different incentives, etc. So we wanted to know whether or not there are any panels who did have specific recruitment practices in place. Very, very few panel providers said that they did have specific recruitment practices. That isn't to say they weren't just as aware of the importance of this, but again, throughout, there was a lot of concern from panel providers that potentially, you know, the cost of you know, trying to go out and find those people wouldn't be covered, you know, and that potentially, you know, clients weren't willing to pay or help to pay towards the work that would be needed to do that. So at the moment, we're finding that very few panels have got a strategy for this, for kind of improving specific minority group respondent recruitment. So we went on to ask people, okay, if you're not asking it as a quota variable, are you at least asking it as a question in your survey? So this question was only asked to people who'd said that no, they weren't already using it as a quota. So if we look through here, you know, obviously a sizable number of participants are already asking an extended version of gender in their NatRep surveys. This was quite surprising, actually, that there was a reasonable percentage of people saying that they never ask extended gender. I don't know if there was maybe a misunderstanding on that question. I know that from my experience, and certainly MRS best practice, you know, it would be very unusual now for us to see a questionnaire land on our desk that only has male and female. I would have expected everybody to kind of be asking an extended gender, but you know, maybe there's some more work we need to do on that to make sure people are aware that, you know, male and female alone isn't enough to have in your gender questions anymore. A sizable majority said that ethnicity and sexual orientation and health questions are being asked at least occasionally. And just to note here, and again, a lot of respondents mentioned this, and it's something we're fully aware of, a lot of people did point out that until the release of the 2021 census data, which has those more inclusive questions for the first time, there is a lack of reliable UK statistics on extended gender and sexual orientation, for example. So that could be reducing the frequency in which those questions are A, being set as quotas, B, being asked at all, because a lot of people pointed out, as we will see later on, they don't have census data, for example, on sexual orientation at the moment. So the inability to set reliable targets, I think, is having an effect on people's ability or willingness to ask that question at all. So we asked them what the challenges were in kind of making sure that you know, these minority groups were included in the sample. Some people felt that, you know, there is potentially an issue that we need to be realistic about with online panels in general, you know. So as you can see on the right, this person kind of saying that, you know, even with some characteristics that potentially we might think we can put a tick against, like age, there's still always going to be a skew, and you know, if you have a top age band that's 65 plus, for example, that probably, you know, is saying it's probably not realistic to say that represents everyone 65 plus, because it probably doesn't have much representation of people who are aged 80, for example. And some felt that the panel providers should be doing more to address this. Someone has said here that minority groups are by definition tiny. I think that is true with some minority groups. I don't think that's true for all. I think there are some minority groups that make up a huge voice. But also, again, this person is pointing out, you know, the issues around non-English speakers, for example, visual impairments, tending not to answer surveys specifically online. So that, you know, there are kind of themes of barriers that people are finding throughout. And again, as I said, you know, people mentioned the challenge of knowing whether the proportions are correct. The challenge of the costs that it takes to reach these people, and kind of people not having the budget. You know, there was a lot of mention of kind of end clients potentially wanting it, you know, quickly and cheaply, you know, and asking for NatRep samples of 2,000 in 24 hours, and that, you know, the more quotas you add to that, the more difficult that becomes, and potentially costly, and that potentially that wasn't being taken into account in research briefs. So we asked people who weren't already asking these questions, do you think you are likely to add these questions in the next 2 years? And you'll see there that, you know, so these are people who say, no, we're not currently asking this at all, but that's quite a reasonable proportion of those people who, again, for ethnicity, are saying, we're not asking it right now, but we do expect to add this in the next 2 years. So I think that's very positive. And that, I think, is positive across the board there, you know, sexual orientation included. So we think that that's good. you know, and one of the things and the reasons why we've been pushing the need for best practice guides so much, and we'll talk about a bit later, is a slight anxiety on how to ask the questions. And maybe these people are going, yes, I do anticipate asking this. Either A, once some guidelines come out on how to ask it, and also B, I think, you know, some of that is being led by that in the next 2 years, we will have that census data available. So it does look like there's a sizable number of companies not doing it at the moment who do have full expectation that they will be doing this in 2 years' time. Okay, so here's where we got into the kind of the nitty-gritty of the questions. So we asked people, do you think it would be beneficial to extend the definition of nationally representative to include, and then we asked individually about each of these questions. So is it beneficial to extend this definition to include ethnicity? Is it beneficial to include sexual orientation, for example? So if we look at the ethnicity bar there, I think that is overwhelmingly positive. You know, the vast majority of people are saying, yes, it would be beneficial to the sector if we included ethnicity in our definition of NatRep. We went on, anyone who said either yes or no to this question, we went on to ask them kind of why they said that and give us a bit more detail. And with ethnicity, you know, again, I think there's a very clear mandate here. People were saying it has a huge impact on the data. You know, it's critical that they're included. And that it will make a difference in your results. Lots of people kind of pointing out that there are potentially commercial benefits and missed opportunities here for brands who aren't making sure that these people are represented. So overwhelmingly, there's a real appetite there to include ethnicity. The question of extended gender, which was kind of the second highest in terms of yes, it would be beneficial. There's an interesting distinction between the reasons for that. So whilst ethnicity, people were kind of talking very much about the data and the research itself and it having an impact on results, the extended gender and the appetite for that, it seemed to be much more around social inclusion reasons and, you know, making sure people can answer in a way that's respectful to them, that reflects themselves, rather than anyone kind of particularly saying that it would affect the data. So it was an interesting distinction that there was still a good appetite for including extended gender, but more for kind of engagement, you know, inclusion and making sure that we're asking things in a correct way, as opposed to it having a massive data shift, which ethnicity was seen to have had. So if we look at sexual orientation, so this was the lowest one. There's the least appetite to include sexual orientation. And the reasons for that, as we've said, varied from the sweeping, someone suggesting that sexual orientation does not have a bearing on opinions, to kind of the more nuanced end, you know, and whether it does impact. There was also, and again, this has come up, you know, time and time again, there is a feeling that sexual orientation is a much more personal and invasive question to ask than ethnicity, and that maybe people are very or more open to giving their ethnicity than they are to giving their sexual orientation. And I think that is a very valid point. You know, and I think that the work that needs to be done there is potentially on us being a bit better at explaining to participants, you know, why are we asking for this information? You know, why is it important? And kind of really demonstrating that it's being used for reasons of inclusion and not exclusion. You know, but we kind of can see here that sexual orientation, that there are still a lot of people who think that if it directly affects the research brief, ask it. If it's a survey about yogurt, don't ask it, for example. And then physical and mental health conditions. So again, that is high, nearly as high as extended gender. And they were thought to be important, but by far, this one was the one where people recognized that the barriers to this were potentially much, much harder to overcome than the other three. And I think that's just because, you know, unlike the other three, there are physical barriers, technological barriers here. You know, if you're a wheelchair user trying to attend an in-person focus group, for example, if you're visually impaired and you're trying to take an online survey, you know, so there are barriers there that need to be overcome that maybe the other three don't have. And again, you know, there's lots of work that needs to be done in that space. You know, we all know that technology it means that we can now do things. You know, we can do things to make sure that, you know, our online surveys are compatible with screen readers, for example, for visually impaired, that they're being designed in that way. But it's a lot of work, and I think everyone was kind of saying that disabilities are something that need to be addressed in a much more different way than the other three characteristics. So going back to kind of asking and getting the language right, this was kind of a hypothesis that the group had from kind of some focus group work we did last year, which was that potentially there was some anxiety from organizations around asking these questions because they didn't know necessarily the best way to ask it, what the wording should be, what the responses should be, etc. And that potentially that anxiety or that lack of confidence around the language may have been stopping people from asking these questions. So, you know, you can see, you know, there's no more than 50% across any of those where people are saying, I am completely confident in how to ask this question. Ethnicity, you know, again, across the board is the one with the highest confidence, but there are still people saying, you know, that they are not confident or they're fairly confident. And again, it's one of the reasons why we want to run this again in 12 months, because MRS have recently released best practice guides for all 4 of these characteristics. So you can now go on the MRS website, download those best practice guides that will give you code compliant examples of how to ask these questions. So what we're really hoping is that in 12 months time, when we ask this, that the confidence in how to ask these questions, what language to use, has improved. So that's what we're hoping will happen. And as one participant did say, that guidance on the model wording is something that people were really, really keen to get, which we have now issued. So we're hoping that'll make a difference on this next year. So cost did come up a lot. You know, panel providers said, you know, that sample costs are very, very keen. The margins aren't huge. And kind of, you know, again, there was a debate around where the onus of this lay. Did it lay with the client to be willing, you know, to demand more rigorous definitions, to be willing to pay a bit more, you know, and again, pushback from the panel saying, you know, actually some clients aren't even paying properly for representative samples online right now, let alone with adding, you know, additional characteristics. On the other hand, you know, there are, again, clients who are saying, you know, and I think if we look at the next slide, we ask clients, you know, and agencies, would they be willing to pay more? So would you be willing to pay more for a NatRep sample that was also representative on ethnicity, for example, on sexual orientation, on health? So ethnicity and health were being perceived as more valuable in this context. And sexual orientation and extended gender more in the light of inclusivity. Ethnicity and health, you know, were interesting. Again, people seem to be, from the comments, more willing to pay more for physical disabilities and mental health conditions, again, because of that recognition of how much harder it was. So they were kind of going, if we specifically need to make sure we're representative on physical disability, for example, there was an acceptance that they would have to pay more to be able to access those people. Although ethnicity is higher, interestingly, it's not as high as maybe you might expect, considering that throughout, ethnicity has been seen as something that definitely should be included. And again, from clients, the feel from that is that whilst they think it's essential in the main, they almost think that they shouldn't have to pay more for ethnicity because it should be standard, that they should be able to get a representative sample of the UK that is representative on ethnicity without having to pay more. So, you know, it's a disconnect, I think, there. And then finally, we kind of asked, you know, what else? What else is there? You know, obviously NatRep is a big part of research, but it's not the only kind of question when it comes to inclusion and representation. Again, there was lots of people kind of going, you know, we need to be aware. Obviously, the 4 characteristics that we're discussing, that doesn't then mean full representation, you know, and again, as people have said, you know, people who lack internet access, you know, poverty or social mobility issues, insufficient language skills, you know, and kind of SEND groups. So there were a lot of people quite rightly saying, you know, the conversation doesn't end with these 4 groups. You know, we need to think about, you know, representation of all. Again, there were people pointing out that, you know, our upper age band is probably not representative, etc. But, you know, some really, really positive kind of comments on this topic, you know, and saying that it's a topic that has started to gain real traction, that, you know, companies are talking about this, clients are talking about this all the time, and that, you know, this examination of what we mean by NatRep is vital, you know, and that we all need to work together to kind of try and make sure that we are making inroads here, and that this product that we are selling, you know, for a majority of our projects is kind of fit for purpose, and that if we're claiming representation, we can kind of back that up. So that is the end of the report. So I'm going to unshare my screen. And I could kind of see, it was quite nerve-wracking. I could see lots of comments coming up as I was talking, but I couldn't see what they were. Deborah, was there any? I don't think I can see the questions.
If you can't see them, I will relay them over. Is that okay?
Yeah, I can't see the questions. Yeah.
Okay, so the first comment we received is some of the desire to collect this in part influenced by it being special category data? Even when anonymous, do you think this is putting people off? That's the first observation.
Well, Deborah, do you want to talk a little bit about special category data? Because we do get that a lot, you know, in terms of how special category data links into GDPR, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I think the important thing is that special category data, whilst having an extra set of conditions, these sort of Article 9 conditions you have to follow to be able to collect special category data, because most research data is collected with permission anyway, you meeting that additional requirement to be able to collect special category data is already there. So I think that there is a instinctive barrier to because it's special category data, but actually when you do it practically, that can be very readily overcome based upon, you know, just asking the questions, and also think about things like building panel data and so on. Again, when you're doing that, you're asking a whole load of things from people at that when they join a panel. So building it into the panel data collection stage should be relatively straightforward. And again, you're doing it very transparently. You're doing it with consent and as part of a contract when you get somebody as a panelist. So it shouldn't be an issue. But I'm sure Graham and Sanya, you know, you've got experience as practitioners here. Disabuse me of my innocence.
Well, Graham, I'll let you maybe talk about the technicalities. I know from the audience point of view, I think sometimes it's also trying to explain why the data is being collected and the benefits. So I know quite a few friends of mine who are influencers in like the South Asian space. They were working with the ONS to do like videos to explain the importance of the census and having data collected and the role it can play then impacting society. There have been examples in the past of, you know, very public research that has actually harmed certain minority groups. So I think there is that kind of resistance as well. But what we look at with the representation group is how can we sort of explain why this is being asked so it's not too intrusive, but it does give people enough context. And then it's up to them, I suppose, if they want to share the information. But the onus is on us to try and explain the benefits and why we're doing it.
Yeah, just following on from your point, Sanya, it's about us really letting people know what is the data going to be used for. And let's be honest, this conversation has been ongoing for a long time now. Yes, I feel in the past a lot more people were put off even when it was anonymous, but I feel far more people will be open to sharing data now, especially considering what we're seeing all around us, especially considering the fact that there is a drive to make changes and evolve, and everybody wants to be involved in that. There is a desire for us to start moving forwards and seeing change. So yeah, I think we'll start seeing a lot more people being open to share this data moving forwards.
And just to, yeah, exactly. So I think last couple of years there's been a lot of have your voice heard, have your say. I think people are very much more inclined to want to do that. So we shouldn't allow that to be a barrier, because like you said, Graham, I think it's less from the audience point of view. I think they're interested in doing it.
You're on mute, Deborah.
At least once a day this happens. In the chat, it was quite interesting. Somebody responding to that comment said they agreed with the observation, said our company is far more likely to include this question if and when we have reliable secondary data to compare to, which is an interesting comment. This whole point that Rebecca, that you were saying about actually, having a data set that, like the census data, that you can use to do your modeling and stuff is quite important, and actually the limitation on number of sources.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, we are very aware, the census, as we were discussing before the webinar, actually, we were hoping that the 2021 census data would have been released already. They've just released the first tranche of it, but the inclusive questions are more likely to be late autumn that they come out. And I think someone's asked kind of how do we set targets?
Yes, its question is, how do you suggest that we incorporate extended gender and sexual orientation into NatRep quotas until the 2021 census results are released?
Yeah, so there are, of course, the census is kind of our gold standard, and I think as soon as we get those released, we'll all have to be updating everything, not just these new characteristics, your age, your genders, everything. Your regions will need updating. There are sources, ONS data available. They do the APS survey, they do the household survey, that does give you steer on those things, and there are ways you can set targets. Again, on the MRS website now, there's a representation in research FAQs document, and one of the questions on there is, where should we go to get our quota targets? It's a stopgap until the 2021 data gets released, and and we are aware of that. And as I kind of said during the report, no one thinks that tomorrow everyone should be doing all of this on every NatRep project, because that would be unrealistic and it would be unreasonable. We know that there are very, very, very valid barriers at the moment, that will slowly, hopefully, get over. It's more around, and I think the main drive of this piece of work was to kind of move away from NatRep being shorthand for actually nothing. It was kind of just used without ever kind of defining it. So the client might say, oh, I need a NatRep survey, and then it went to the agency, and then the provider, and then the panels. And by the time you get back up, we didn't know actually, well, what did you mean by that? Is it the same thing as what we meant? So, and again, Graham, it would be good to hear your thoughts on this around, one of the main things that we're trying to encourage is transparency, right? Around what do we mean when we say NatRep? Not to say it has to be all these things, but we want it to not be hidden.
I think that's the most interesting point with regards to when we think about NatRep. It's about transparency, because like you said, this is going to be a very, very long journey. We're not going to get there overnight. We're not going to get it done perfectly either. Some people may experience far more barriers to achieving this new updated NatRep than others as well. So for us, I think the main important thing is to be transparent. When you're saying you have a NatRep data set, what characteristics does it include? Being transparent with that means that if you do have limitations, you are actually stating up front, well, this is my definition of what NatRep means. And that may differ from others as well, but it's fine as long as you are communicating that, being upfront, making sure that you're having a conversation with your client upfront to say, okay, well, this is what we define NatRep as. And the conversation is ongoing at this moment, and there may be different definitions of NatRep, but this is what we are choosing to go with at this moment in time.
That's quite interesting also, because one of the other comments that come through in the chat is somebody said, we actually had a client insist we take out the questions about ethnicity and disability. So obviously we've been focusing quite a lot on the supplier's journey, but there's also the question about clients here.
Yeah, and I mean, that's interesting. I'd be interested to know what the reasons were, but again, and again, this is kind of MRS kind of code and best practice is, that the role of the agency is to work with the client to define that research. So again, we are not in any way saying that you demand that your client includes those. And in that situation, if you'd had a conversation with them about NatRep, and at least at the start of that conversation, all of those characteristics on the table, and you had a discussion with them about which you were going to include and which realistically you could include. If they then decide, well, I don't want those, that's absolutely fine. It just means that then when you're writing any reports or you're declaring anything as NatRep in there, it would just simply say NatRep, and then it would say as a footnote, as defined by age, gender, region, or social grade, or whatever, again. So yeah, we're not mandating to anyone, certainly, that you have to disagree with your clients. It's maybe just kind of having that conversation and going, we're not going to assume that by NatRep you only mean age, gender, and region. And sorry, Sarah, just saying they thought it was unnecessary, not relevant to the brief. Fine, but I mean, even that in itself is progress, that conversation was had with them, so yeah, the clients that we work with them to define the research.
And just to add to that, so where we're looking at I guess the numbers of the population that will be included in that, it is about transparency. So say we've got 1,000 people and you've got about 13% of ethnic minorities, or for example, 7% British Asians, you only really get like 70 people within that sample. So it's not swaying it too much. Also, you've got to be transparent. You can't do much. That's not representative of that group, right? If you've got 70, the margins of error are just huge. So it's sort of not, it's just trying to give voice to the population as a whole. If you did want to reach those groups in more depth, then you'd want to get, 300-400 if you can, but it's challenging through like panels and stuff. So I guess you can get that point across. It's not going to skew the data completely. It's just the voice of the nation. And then if they wanted to do more targeted research, you can then try and direct that more specifically at larger samples of minority groups.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Sanya. And actually, I can now see the chat, Deborah. So yeah, Lee Chan has just raised a really, which we get all the time, where he's saying, interlinked targets are important, and the worry is that you make progress by ethnicity, but you just have younger people, which is absolutely right. But Sanya, again, you've done a lot of work on ideally disaggregating data and the limitations to your sizes and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I spent quite a bit of time in the training session looking at margins of error of different sizes and how you can go about it, because there are very real constraints with minority groups and reaching them in large enough numbers. Also, those that are on panels, it's a very certain, I suppose, type. Those who are like quite aware of research, I think a lot of people don't sometimes know. So it's just being mindful of that. You can, I suppose, supplement with qualitative. You can maybe do free finding if you can, but again, just within the parameters of, you will have skews in your samples. At this minute, for example, British Asians are very young age population. They might be geographically placed certain places. If you're going to get very, very, I suppose, tight on those quotas, ideal as that is, right now, I suppose it's just challenging to meet that. So it's sort of working within the parameters of what we currently have access to. But in an ideal world, for sure, you would want to do that.
Absolutely. And, there's a lot of things that, we all discuss all the time, which is kind of, we cannot wait for perfection. We're aiming for progress.
Absolutely.
And perfection, and absolutely, that, for example, the kind of the fact that at the moment when we're having this discussion, we're including physical disabilities and mental health conditions in the same characteristic. Now we know that ideally you would split those out, because of course physical disability barriers are completely different to kind of, mental health conditions and things like that. At the moment, we kind of can't split them out, in part because the census didn't split it out. So, we wouldn't have targets for it, disaggregated. But again, it's about having that awareness that there is still limitations, but having, representation of disabilities and physical mental health conditions at all is better than not having it at all. And I know, that conversations that, again, with even within physical disabilities, you might get an online survey where you go, oh yes, we've managed to get a quota of representative physical disabilities, but you're probably tending towards a certain group of physical disabilities there. And if it's an online survey, then you probably don't have representation of visual impairments, for example. So yeah, the barriers are huge, the limitations are huge, especially, if you're talking about NatRep surveys, yeah, they normally are kind of 1,000, 2,000, so Sanya, as you were saying, they're going to be small for those people. But yeah, it's about kind of moving the dial and trying to kind of make progress in this space, whilst never ever claiming that it's absolutely perfect and that we're representative of everyone. Graham, I don't know if you had anything to add to that.
Yeah, I was going to add there, you raise a very, very important point there in terms of it's about progress over perfection. There'll be times when you are going to panel providers and asking for costs and feasibilities, and you'll see that trying to target these characteristics, you get very small numbers back. But that shouldn't put you off from actually still trying to go ahead, because ultimately you'll see that there's so much work being done in the back end with a lot of panel providers now as they try to evolve their targeting. There's so much work that's being done. I can talk on behalf of SINT in terms of the pre-targeting profiling that they have in place. And there's been so much work that they've done with Insights in Colour to look at the US market and see how they can evolve that. Now that was completed at the back end of last year. They're working very closely now with CORE to look at how we can start to evolve the UK profiling and ensure that is far more representative. So yes, there are barriers and there are limitations right now, but as we continue to see things progress and evolve, we should see those barriers reduce as we get further and further down this journey.
Well, and just to add, I'm always going on about this, but I've been doing this for 10, 12 years is when I started. And back then we'd at Ethnos built a panel of minority ethnic groups or individuals. We had 20,000 plus, but we didn't have the demand. So it kind of disappeared, or it was too high per person for incentives. Now I'm just so grateful that things are changing. There's demand from clients. We see the commercial, we were discussing that, are we doing it because it's representation, the right thing to do? What's actually, because there's a commercial need with all of these diverse shows and things to actually understand minority groups more. So we have definitely, I think, progressed and really accelerated in the last couple of years. So I think we're finally starting to address some of the maybe structural challenges to get us to the point we need to be. But yeah, progress, I think, is happening for sure.
Yeah, and I don't want to disclose too much and give a spoiler, but obviously there's perception about the commercial benefits to having representative data. So there's currently work being done to really investigate this. Matt Reynolds and his team at Victory as well. So we're looking forward to seeing the results of this and seeing how we can use this to continue to evolve the sector.
Yeah, and Graham touched on a little bit about what's happening in the US in this space. They are looking at it as well. And yeah, just to kind of frame, of course, we are only talking about the UK, and I'll be aware that most people on this webinar deal in research in more markets than just the UK. And of course, you might look at this and kind of have that, but it's not, and then it's not relevant in France or Germany, certainly with some markets where you can't ask ethnicity. So we are aware that different markets will need different approaches. And again, if you take a look through some of the resources that MRS offer, what we've tried to do in that space is kind of approach it from a principles basis. So the principles of inclusive research rather than the specific details, because of course the more specific you get, the less relevant it is as soon as you look at a different market. But again, on the FAQs, there is a section that talks about what are the principles of inclusive research. So if anyone reads any of those FAQs, there are a lot of them, I would recommend reading that one, because again, those principles can be applied to any research project, in fact, whatever the market is. So I think that's really important to kind of think of it from a principles basis, and then also if you're coming at it from a principles basis as well, it means it's easier if you're dealing with clients who have more specific thoughts on the area or whatever. You can still make sure that your research is being designed in an inclusive way. So,
and yeah, Rebecca, just to add to that, the training that we're doing with Goodbye to Stereotypes, it's kind of, because this, I suppose it is, there's so much, it's hard to know how to approach it. So we sort of have a framework that you can apply to different groups and different, there's a lot of different communities within diversity. So it's just having that approach mindset rather than, stuck to any one particular.
Yeah, we've had a really good question in, Graham, which I think you're perfect for. So do you think it's down to agencies to drive the demand here and explain to clients the need and push providers to provide this sample?
That's a very good question. Personally, I think it's down to all of us. It's down to agencies, it's down to panel providers, it's down to clients. Everybody has a responsibility here. This is something that is not just about our own individual projects, our own individual research that we're doing. This is about the entire industry. And the more we see it happening, the more that will drive the demand. Now, obviously, I appreciate we've spoken about the limitations and the barriers that we see currently. But the more that we carry on doing this work, that's how you'll see people leading by example, and you'll see there'll be so much more, so many more hurdles will be overcome, and clients will start to see far more benefits of being able to do it. At the same time, it goes hand in hand with the panels working on their profiling in the back end as well. And as they continue to go down this journey, I think that will increase demand. But we're keen to hear your thoughts as well on that, Sanya.
Yeah, no, I definitely am seeing that a lot. People are wanting to now do more in target, and which is quite exciting. So I think we're almost trying to catch up to, and they're like, I want 1,000, ethnic minorities. And I'm like, right, okay, well, can't quite get that necessarily yet in the ideal way, but let's do some, and then we can use Qual. But it's great to see that. I do think things are changing, and like I'm always going on about, shows like Bridgerton and all these others that are just flipping it on its head, and you realize the value of diversity, the commercial value, it's starting to become quite exciting. So with that in mind, I think as an industry, we do need to get ourselves to that point where we can be, support those clients and really show value through research to those that are maybe ahead of the game.
Yeah, and I think also that the work that we've been doing with the MRS's Senior Client Council and talking with them about inclusion, there's a real passion within the Senior Client Council about this topic. And recently we also issued 3 new guidelines from the Senior Client Council, so client-side practitioners with a client-side perspective on inclusion. And these guidelines are much more about the practical issues of looking at things like language, methodology, and samples, and so on. And they're also available on the inclusion element of the MRS website. But I think this is a case of the two sides of the community coming together with a clear recognition that we need to do much more, and a desire to do much more. And now it's the how do we do that? How do we bridge this desire and do it in a way that is going to meet clients' needs and be practical for suppliers as well, and also meet all the principles of scientific research and sampling and all those kinds of things. But I think I do feel like now it's very much that all sides of the sector are on the same page.
Yeah, and I think one very, very simple thing that everybody in attendance can do now, whether you're a client or an agency or a provider, is just refuse to take NatRep as a shorthand. If you get a brief that says NatRep, just say, can you tell me what you want included in that, and get people used to going, okay, I'm going to have to define this. It's not just a default, it is a thought process, and I've kind of started doing that to my clients, which probably annoys them, but I just think, well, I'll get used to it. If I get a brief that says NatRep, it's like, what characteristics do you mean by that? And I think that's an easy thing that people, and you'll start seeing it now that it happens all the time, and we kind of then just pass it on. So yeah, everyone just kind of push back on that and just say, I think I know what you mean by that, but actually you might mean something different. So can we define this? Another really interesting question from Luke. Hi, Luke. So he said there's a slight sidestep, but it's interesting, Luke, because he's talking about, how we decide which characteristics are included anyway. And Luke says he finds it interesting that we don't currently quota, unless project specific, instance of kids as part of NatRep, given that this information has been available for a long time, and arguably that change in life stage is likely to drive very different behaviours and attitudes. So Luke, that question that we asked, where it was an open-ended box and asked people to put it in, life stage, and / household composition / kids, was in there. It was mentioned by some people, but low. It was, yeah, I mean, you know, at 49, maybe kind of a handful of people said that they thought life stage or kids should be in there. But I mean, it's an interesting point. You know, I wonder why we've kind of gone age, gender, region. I mean, is life stage actually more important than gender? You know, if you're a mother or a father newly, you know, actually, is that the thing that defines your change in behavior more than whether you're a mother or a father? I don't know. Sania, have you got any thoughts on that?
I guess, yeah, well, Deborah, I'd love to get your view on this too. I think I suppose it's really tricky, right? Because you could have so much. I think for those sorts of things, it's important, if that's a variable that's of interest, to put it in your survey, and then to know and to be able to like look at subgroup behaviors through that. I guess we're looking at maybe the key, I suppose I don't know how to say that without putting my foot in it, really. But no, I think it's I'm gonna yeah, I guess it's just maybe key characteristics that are driving the shape of the nation, with things like health and ethnicity, because we could take it further, I suppose, where that's maybe how it's being defined. But anyone else, please help me out on this.
Well, I would just say, I guess, you know, my guess would be, if we think about the traditional composition of panels, that group of people, so parents, for example, are probably not underrepresented at the moment. You know, they probably are represented on panels. So yes, if you ask the question, so you capture it, I'd imagine that, you know, there are a fair number of people on the panels, and maybe the ones that we were focusing on a bit more was kind of ones that historically may have been underrepresented. But I agree with Luke that I think, you know, as a characteristic, it's probably a real driver of behavior. But I think that probably panels are better representative of parents.
Yeah, and I think, sorry, yeah, that I've got a better clarity on what to say there and now. I think it's like, so the whole point of data is to look at the needs of maybe marginalized groups or underrepresented. So having them in our quotas just means that we are able to then make sure they're included, and we're able to sort of do something about those who are less ahead generally. So yeah.
And I think also, I mean, you know, if there's always a balancing thing here as well, you know, about being proportionate about what you need, because you know, GDPR does have requirements about things like data minimization, and you know, you only should collect data that you are going to use and you need it for something. But if there is a purpose, and that purpose could be just being able to classify somebody correctly in terms of where they are in the life stage, so there is a clear need for it, then you know, this information can be collected, and it's just making sure it's proportionate. You know, at the end of the day, we all have the right to a private life, and we don't want to chapter and verse about everything about somebody, but having certain pieces of key information that gives us a good indication about where they are, what they're doing, and has a use and a purpose to enable us to improve representativeness of samples, then that's clearly a good place to be in my view. And I think also, as things evolve, we'll start to there'll be new norms will be created and agreed about, you know, what it is that we can collect and what is reasonable to be able to collect to be able to get to this point. And we're just kind of going through that teasing out phase now to be able to get there. But it's good that we're on the journey, because we weren't before. So
I think we're nearly out of time, Deborah, are we?
Afraid we are. It's been a really, really fascinating conversation. We've had some great comments as well in the chat. Real engagement by people, which is fantastic.
And will people be mailed the link to the recording, Deborah, if they didn't get to catch it? Or
yeah, we can arrange for that. That's no problem at all. But it normally takes us just under a week to do any editing out and to get the link up on the website. But then it will be freely available, so people can share it and listen in again.
And I would also say, you know, anyone attending who wants to kind of discuss anything like this further, please do get in touch with the Representation and Research Group, or myself on LinkedIn, or Graham and Sania on LinkedIn. I'm sure they wouldn't mind. So if you go to the MRS webpage under the topic of inclusion, you can find the Representation and Research Group on there, and there's contact. Because yeah, you know, the more companies we talk to one-on-one, and the more kind of chats we have, kind of the more it helps us to kind of work out what do we need to be offering in terms of support and resources and things like that. So genuinely, I would welcome anyone get in touch if you want to just have a further conversation about anything that we've talked about. That would be great.
Thank you. Bye now.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
you.